When Rebecca Hayes stepped off the dusty train in Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory, with 7 orphaned children clinging to her worn traveling dress, she carried nothing but a carpetbag of belongings and a heart full of desperate hope. The journey from Boston had taken every penny she possessed, funded by the sale of her late parents' modest home and the promise of marriage to a cattle rancher who claimed he wanted a ready-made family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't know was that Thomas Hartwell had been expecting a childless widow, not a young woman barely 23 years old, surrounded by a small army of children ranging from toddler twins to a protective 12-year-old, who watched every stranger with suspicious eyes. The rejection that followed would echo through the small mountain town. But sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives are merely detours leading us exactly where we belong. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Cedar Falls as the Denver and Rio Grande locomotive wheezed to a stop at the modest wooden platform that served as the town's train station. Black smoke billowed from the engine's stack, mixing with the dust kicked up by the grinding wheels, creating a haze that made Rebecca Hayes squint as she peered through the passenger car window. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the few belongings scattered around their seats, while 7 pairs of eyes looked to her for reassurance she wasn't entirely sure she could provide. "Are we really going to live here, Becca?" Grace whispered, her 5-year-old voice barely audible above the hissing steam. The little girl pressed closer to Rebecca's side, her small fingers clutching the worn fabric of Rebecca's navy traveling dress. The child's auburn curls, so similar to Rebecca's own, had escaped the careful braids Rebecca had woven that morning, giving her a wild, anxious appearance that mirrored how they all felt. Rebecca smoothed Grace's hair with gentle fingers, summoning a smile that she hoped appeared more confident than she felt. "Yes, sweetheart. This is our new home. Mr. Hartwell is waiting for us, and we're going to have a real house with rooms for everyone and land to run and play on." The words felt strange in her mouth, like a fairy tale she was telling rather than the reality they were stepping into. Emma, the eldest at 12, shifted baby Rose from one hip to the other while keeping a firm grip on 3-year-old Ruby's hand. Her dark eyes, so serious for someone who should still be playing with dolls, met Rebecca's gaze with a mixture of hope and worry that broke Rebecca's heart anew. Emma had grown up too fast since their parents died in the factory fire 6 months ago, taking on responsibilities no child should bear. "Remember what we practiced," Emma murmured to the younger children. "Best behavior, and we stay together, no matter what." Jacob, 10 years old and stubborn as a mule, crossed his arms and scowled at the window. "I still don't see why we had to leave Boston. We could have made it on our own." His voice carried the bitter edge of a boy forced to become a man too soon, and Rebecca's chest tightened with familiar guilt. She had wrestled with the decision for weeks, weighing their dwindling resources against the uncertainty of traveling west to marry a stranger. "Because sometimes the best thing we can do is start fresh," Rebecca replied softly, though doubt gnawed at her insides like a persistent ache. The letter from Thomas Hartwell had arrived just when her small inheritance was running out, and the landlord was demanding rent she couldn't pay. His proposal had seemed like divine intervention, offering marriage and a home for her and whatever family obligations she might have. She had been honest about the children in her response, describing each one carefully and explaining how they had come to be in her care. When his next letter arrived confirming his eagerness to meet them all, she had seen it as a sign that their luck was finally changing. The conductor appeared at their row, his weathered face kind but impatient. "Cedar Falls, folks. End of the line for this train. You'll want to gather your things." He glanced at the children with raised eyebrows but said nothing more, having grown accustomed to the unusual circumstances of frontier travel during his years on the rails. Rebecca stood carefully, balancing little Grace on her hip while Emma managed the twins, and the older children collected the few bags that contained everything they owned in the world. The task of getting 7 children and their meager belongings off the train felt overwhelming, but somehow they managed, forming a small parade down the narrow aisle as other passengers watched with curiosity and varying degrees of sympathy. The platform was smaller than Rebecca had imagined, barely large enough to accommodate the handful of people who had gathered to meet the train. Cedar Falls stretched before them in all directions, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a single main street that disappeared into rolling hills dotted with cattle and horses. The mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth in the valley below. Rebecca scanned the small crowd, looking for a man who matched Thomas Hartwell's description in his letters. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying brown hair and kind eyes, he had written. A successful cattle rancher who valued hard work and family above all else. She spotted him almost immediately, standing apart from the others with his hat in his hands, an expression that made her stomach drop to her boots. Thomas Hartwell was indeed tall and broad-shouldered, his brown hair touched with silver at the temples, but the kindness he had described in his eyes was nowhere to be found. Instead, she saw shock, dismay, and something that looked uncomfortably like horror as his gaze moved from her face to the cluster of children surrounding her. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air, and Rebecca felt the first cold fingers of dread creeping up her spine. "Mr. Hartwell?" she called, her voice carrying across the platform with more confidence than she felt. Several conversations stopped as curious onlookers turned to watch the unfolding scene. Cedar Falls was clearly a small enough town that the arrival of strangers, especially ones traveling with an unusual number of children, was noteworthy entertainment. Thomas Hartwell approached slowly, his steps heavy and reluctant. When he reached speaking distance, he removed his hat completely, revealing a receding hairline and deep worry lines creased across his forehead. "Miss Hayes, I presume?" His voice sounded strained, nothing like the warm, reassuring tone she had imagined while reading his letters on the long, uncertain journey west. "Mrs. Hayes," Rebecca corrected gently, though she had never been married. The title was a deliberate choice, a small shield of propriety she hoped would help them be accepted in their new community. "Yes, I'm Rebecca. And these are the children I mentioned in my letters." She gestured toward the cluster of young faces at her side, each child peeking up at him with a mix of hope and hesitation. Thomas Hartwell's jaw tightened as he silently counted them, his lips moving ever so slightly as he tallied. When he reached 7, he closed his eyes for a moment, as though hoping they'd vanish if he simply willed it. "I assumed," he said cautiously, "when you mentioned children, that you meant 1 or 2, 3 at most." The platform around them fell into a kind of hush, though Rebecca could feel the eyes and ears of bystanders drawn in by the drama unfolding in real time. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and simmering anger at his barely masked dismay. "I was very clear in my letters," she said, her voice steady though her hands were beginning to tremble. "Emma is 12, Jacob 10, Lily 8, Samuel 6, Grace 5, and the twins Rose and Ruby are 3. I described each of them, their personalities, their needs, their stories." A shadow of confusion flickered across Thomas's face, followed by something closer to panic. "I received no such letters," he said firmly. "Only one. You accepted my proposal and mentioned having family obligations, but I assumed that meant looking after neighbors' children now and then, or perhaps a relative's children during occasional visits." Rebecca felt as though the ground might give way beneath her feet, though she remained still. The children, sensing the shift in tone, huddled closer to her. Emma stepped subtly in front of the younger ones, her instinct to protect taking over. "That can't be right," Rebecca said, though uncertainty was creeping into her voice. "I sent 3 letters." I described each child, even included a small photograph of us together. Thomas shook his head slowly, his weathered face. Drawn. I never saw any photograph, just the one letter. He ran a hand through his graying hair, clearly overwhelmed. Miss Hayes, I'm a bachelor with a small ranch house. I thought I was welcoming a companion, someone to help with meals and housekeeping. I never anticipated raising 7 children. His words hit like blows, harsh, undeniable. Rebecca had sold everything for this journey. Their last coin had gone to the train fare. Boston was gone. There was no one to turn to, no backup plan, no way home. But in your letter, she said, desperation rising, you said you wanted a family. You talked about starting fresh, about a new beginning. I did want companionship, Thomas said, more firmly now. But this? He gestured toward the children. This isn't what I agreed to. I can barely keep up with my own needs. I can't take on the burden of feeding and raising 7 children. They'll need clothes, education, medical care. It's too much. A soft, heartbreaking sound came from little Grace, who had begun to cry quietly, sensing what was happening. Emma, still composed, stepped forward and lifted her chin. We don't eat much, she said bravely. And we help. Becca taught us how to cook and clean and grow things. We're not a burden. For a moment, something flickered in Thomas's eyes, admiration. Maybe, but it wasn't enough to change his mind. I'm sure you're all good children, he said gently, but I can't do this. Maybe there's a boarding house in town where you can stay until you make other arrangements. His words hung in the air like the smoke from the departing train, which was already beginning to pull away from the platform. Other arrangements. As though she had a list of options. As though there were a safety net for a woman alone in a strange place with 7 children and not a penny to her name. Mr. Hartwell, Rebecca said with quiet force, I sold everything to come here. I uprooted our lives based on your proposal. There are no other arrangements. I trusted you, trusted your word. The accusation landed squarely. Thomas flinched, guilt flashing in his eyes. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, he said stiffly. But I can't be held responsible for plans made based on letters I never received. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'll pay for lodging tonight at Wilson's boarding house, but beyond that, I'm afraid you'll need to find alternative solutions. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. Rebecca felt something break inside her chest, not just her heart but her last reserves of hope and determination. Around them, the platform was beginning to empty as other passengers were claimed by waiting family members or made their way into town. Soon they would be alone with their rejection, standing like refugees in a place that was supposed to have been their salvation. Before she could formulate a response that preserved even a shred of dignity, a new voice cut through the tension like a warm knife through butter. Seems like there's been some kind of mix-up here. Rebecca turned to see a tall man approaching. From the edge of the platform, his long stride eating up the distance between them with easy confidence. Unlike Thomas Hartwell's store-bought clothes and nervous demeanor, this stranger wore well-worn work clothes that spoke of honest labor and practical priorities. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face was weathered by sun and wind in a way that suggested years of outdoor work. But it was his eyes that caught Rebecca's attention. Warm brown eyes that seemed to take in the entire situation with understanding rather than judgment. Nathan Coleman, the stranger said, extending his hand first to Rebecca and then to Thomas Hartwell. His grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of a man who worked with his hands and stood behind his word. I couldn't help but overhear the conversation, and it sounds like there might be some confusion about correspondence. Thomas Hartwell bristled slightly at the implied criticism. There's no confusion on my part. I know what letters I received and what I didn't receive. This lady seems to believe we had an understanding that simply didn't exist. Nathan Coleman nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving from the defensive rancher to Rebecca and the children clustered around her like chicks seeking protection from a storm. Communication can be tricky, especially with mail traveling such distances. Sometimes letters get lost or delayed, and people end up with different understandings of the same situation. His diplomatic response seemed to ease some of the tension, though it didn't solve the fundamental problem of Rebecca's stranded circumstances. She found herself studying this Nathan Coleman, wondering what had brought him to the train platform, and why he seemed inclined to involve himself in the affairs of strangers. "The important thing now," Nathan continued, "is making sure this lady and these children have somewhere safe to stay while they figure out their next steps." He looked directly at Thomas Hartwell with an expression that was friendly but somehow still managed to convey expectation. "I believe you mentioned Wilson's boarding house?" Thomas Hartwell nodded quickly, clearly eager to discharge his obligation and escape the uncomfortable situation. "Yes, of course. One night's lodging, as I said." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, extracting several bills and holding them out to Rebecca. "This should cover your expenses for tonight." Rebecca stared at the money for a long moment, knowing she had no choice but to accept it despite the bitter taste it left in her mouth. Taking charity from the man who had just rejected her and the children felt like swallowing ground glass. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford with 7 young lives depending on her decisions. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking the bills with hands that only trembled slightly. "Your generosity is noted and appreciated." The formality in her tone made it clear that his gesture fell far short of making amends for the broken promises and shattered expectations. But Thomas Hartwell seemed relieved to have fulfilled what he saw as his minimal obligation. He nodded, curtly replaced his hat, and strode away from the platform without another word, leaving Rebecca and the children standing with their borrowed stranger and an uncertain future stretching ahead of them like an unmarked trail. Nathan Coleman watched Thomas Hartwell's retreating figure with an expression that suggested he had formed some opinions about the man's character, none of them particularly flattering. When he turned back to Rebecca, his demeanor was entirely different, warm and reassuring in a way that made some of the tightness in her chest begin to ease. "Well," he said, addressing the children directly, "it seems like you folks have had quite a journey. I bet you're all tired and hungry and ready to get settled somewhere comfortable." He crouched down to Grace's eye level, his voice gentle and patient. "What do you say we get you all to Wilson's boarding house? Mrs. Wilson makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, and I happen to know she baked fresh today." Grace's tears slowed at the mention of pie, and even Jacob's scowl softened slightly. The promise of food and rest after the long train journey was more appealing than their pride could resist, especially coming from someone who seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare rather than eager to escape their presence. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Coleman," Rebecca said, hefting Grace onto her hip while Emma gathered the twins and the older children collected their scattered belongings. "Though I'm not sure why a stranger would involve himself in our difficulties." Nathan Coleman straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and smiled in a way that reached all the way to his eyes. "Maybe because I know what it's like to find yourself in a place where nothing turns out the way you expected," he said simply. "And maybe because these children deserve better than standing on a train platform listening to adults argue about promises and misunderstandings." As they formed a small procession heading toward town, Rebecca found herself walking beside Nathan Coleman while the children arranged themselves around them like a protective formation they had perfected during their months of uncertainty. His presence was oddly comforting, solid and reliable in a way that Thomas Hartwell's nervous energy had never been. "Have you lived in Cedar Falls long?" Rebecca asked, partly to fill the silence and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had stepped into their crisis without hesitation. "About 8 years now," Nathan replied, adjusting his stride to match her shorter steps while keeping an eye on the children to make sure none of them fell behind. Came out here after the war looking for land and peace and quiet. Found more of both than I expected, along with a few things I wasn't looking for. There was something in his tone that suggested stories behind the simple words, but Rebecca didn't feel entitled to ask personal questions of someone who was helping them out of pure kindness. Instead, she focused on the practical concerns that were always present when traveling with 7 children. The boarding house, she began hesitantly. Will it accommodate all of us? I'm afraid Mr. Hartwell's payment might not stretch to cover. Separate rooms for everyone. Nathan Coleman glanced down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Wilson's is a good place, and Martha Wilson has a soft spot for families in transition. I suspect she'll find a way to make it work, especially when she hears your story. The confidence in his voice suggested he knew Martha Wilson well enough to predict her reactions, which made Rebecca wonder about his place in the community, and why he felt comfortable making such assurances on someone else's behalf. Cedar Falls was clearly small enough that residents knew each other's business and character, which could work either for or against newcomers depending on the circumstances of their arrival. As they walked down the main street, Rebecca took her first real look at the town that was supposed to have been their new home. The buildings were mostly wooden, practical structures designed for function rather than beauty, though someone had taken care to plant flowers in boxes beneath several windows. A general store occupied a prominent corner, its windows displaying everything from farm tools to bolts of fabric. Across the street, a small church pointed toward the sky with simple dignity, while a larger building that might have been a meeting hall or school sat at the far end of the main thoroughfare. It was smaller than she had imagined, more isolated than Boston's crowded neighborhoods, but there was something appealing about the way the mountains embraced the valley and the sense that people here probably knew their neighbors' names and circumstances. It could have been a good place to raise children, Rebecca thought with a pang of loss for the future that had been snatched away before it could even begin. Wilson's boarding house turned out to be a 2-story white building with a wide front porch and windows that glowed warmly in the late afternoon light. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of cooking food that made Rebecca's stomach clench with hunger she had been too nervous to acknowledge during the journey. The children pressed closer together as they approached the front steps, their earlier bravery giving way to exhaustion and uncertainty about what came next. Nathan Coleman opened the front door and ushered them into a comfortable sitting room, where a woman emerged from what was presumably the kitchen, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Martha Wilson was shorter than Rebecca, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes that immediately took in the situation with the sort of understanding that suggested she had seen many travelers arrive in various states of distress. "Nathan," she said warmly, "what have you brought me this time?" Her tone was teasing but affectionate, confirming Rebecca's impression that he was well known and well regarded in the community. "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Hayes and her children," Nathan said, his introduction managing to sound both formal and friendly. "They've just arrived on the afternoon train, and there's been a bit of a mix-up with their accommodations. I was hoping you might have room for them tonight." Martha Wilson's gaze moved over the small group, taking in Rebecca's travel-worn dress, the children's tired faces, and the obvious tension that still lingered from their encounter at the train station. Her expression grew warmer, if possible, and she moved toward them with arms already opening in welcome. "Of course I have room," she declared, as if the question had been unnecessary. "Any friend of Nathan's is welcome here, and these children look like they could use a hot meal and a comfortable bed." She addressed the children directly, crouching down to their level much as Nathan had done. "I've got fresh bread cooling in the kitchen and soup simmering on the stove. Would you like to wash up and then come eat something warm?" The children looked to Rebecca for permission, their eyes bright with hope at the prospect of real food and genuine kindness. She nodded, and they followed Martha Wilson toward the back of the house, their voices beginning to lose some of the careful restraint they had maintained since leaving Boston. Rebecca started to follow them, but Nathan Coleman's gentle touch on her arm stopped her. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" he asked quietly. "There are some things about Cedar Falls you might want to know before you start making plans for tomorrow." The request filled Rebecca with fresh anxiety, but she nodded and allowed him to guide her to chairs near the front windows where they could speak quietly without being overheard. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "I don't want to pry into your business," Nathan began carefully, but I couldn't help noticing that Hartwell seemed genuinely surprised by the children. Is it possible there really was some confusion with the correspondence? Rebecca considered the question, fighting the urge to defend herself against any suggestion that she had been less than honest. "I wrote detailed letters," she said firmly. "I described each child, their ages, their personalities, how they came to be in my care. I even mentioned specific needs like Emma's skill with sewing and Jacob's way with animals." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "I believe you," he said simply, which surprised her. "But I also know Thomas Hartwell well enough to think he was telling the truth about what letters he received, which suggests someone or something interfered with your correspondence." The possibility had occurred to Rebecca during the confrontation at the train station, but she had pushed it aside in favor of anger at Hartwell's rejection. Now, with Nathan's calm assessment, she was forced to consider that they might all have been victims of circumstances beyond their control. "Does it matter now?" she asked wearily. "The result is the same either way. We're stranded in a strange place with no resources and nowhere to go." Nathan Coleman leaned forward slightly, his brown eyes serious and intent. "It matters because it means you're not here under false pretenses, and it means the community might be more willing to help than you expect." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But there are things you should know about the situation here, about why Hartwell might not be the only one who sees 7 children as more burden than blessing." Rebecca's stomach tightened with fresh anxiety. "What kind of things?" "Cedar Falls is growing, but it's still a struggling community," Nathan explained. "Drought the last 2 years has hurt the ranchers, and the mining operation up in the hills isn't producing the way they hoped. People are worried about resources, about whether there's enough work and food and opportunity to go around." The words confirmed Rebecca's growing fear that their arrival might be seen as an unwelcome burden by more people than just Thomas Hartwell. 7 additional mouths to feed in a community already struggling with scarcity was not a recipe for warm welcomes and open arms. "I see," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure she wanted to see any more clearly than she already did. "So we're not just homeless, we're unwanted competition for resources that are already stretched thin." Nathan's expression grew more intense, and he reached across the space between their chairs to briefly touch her hand in a gesture that was somehow both comforting and electrifying. "That's one way to look at it," he said. "But there's another perspective, if you're willing to consider it." Rebecca looked up at him, searching his face for some clue about what he was thinking. "What perspective is that?" "That 7 hard-working people, even if some of them are children, represent opportunity rather than burden," Nathan said firmly. "That a woman smart enough to organize a cross-country journey and brave enough to start over in a new place might have skills and talents. This community needs more than it realizes." The words were encouraging, but Rebecca had learned to be wary of easy optimism, especially from strangers who didn't fully understand the challenges of caring for so many children with limited resources. "Mr. Coleman," she began carefully, "I appreciate your kindness more than I can express, but I have to be practical about our situation. Whatever my skills might be, I have 7 children who need food and shelter and care every single day. That's not a burden that disappears just because someone frames it positively. Nathan Coleman nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. You're right, he said. And I'm not trying to minimize the challenges you're facing. But I want you to know that not everyone in Cedar Falls thinks the way Thomas Hartwell does. Before Rebecca could ask what he meant by that, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the kitchen, followed by Martha Wilson's voice raised in good-natured scolding about not eating all the bread before supper. The domestic sounds were so normal, so far removed from the uncertainty and fear that had dominated their lives for months, that Rebecca felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Go eat with your children, Nathan said gently, apparently noticing her emotional response to the sounds of her family being welcomed and fed. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we can talk about what options might be available going forward. Rebecca started to ask what he meant by we, since he had no obligation to involve himself in their problems beyond the kindness he had already shown. But something in his expression suggested the conversation was finished for now. Instead, she nodded and stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirts and trying to gather what remained of her composure. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for everything he had done, but the best she could manage under the circumstances. For helping us at the station, for bringing us here, for treating us like people instead of problems. Nathan Coleman rose as well, his tall frame unfolding with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. Mrs. Hayes, he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made her look up at him more sharply. I meant what I said about options. Don't give up hope just yet. As Rebecca made her way toward the kitchen and the sound of her children's voices, she found herself wondering what Nathan Coleman knew about options that she didn't, and why a stranger would care enough about their future to make such promises. But for tonight, she decided, it was enough that they had found shelter and kindness in a place that had initially offered only rejection and disappointment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but at least they would face them with full stomachs and the memory of genuine human kindness to sustain them through whatever came next. The first light of dawn crept through the lace curtains of Wilson's boarding house, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor where Rebecca Hayes sat fully dressed in the room's single chair. She had not slept, her mind churning with possibilities and fears while the 7 children sprawled across the 2 beds Martha Wilson had somehow managed to provide. The twins, Rose and Ruby, were curled together like puppies, while Grace had somehow migrated to the center of the larger bed, her small limbs spread wide as if claiming territory. Emma lay protectively near the edge, one arm draped over Lily, while Jacob and Samuel shared the smaller bed with the restless energy of boys even in sleep. Rebecca's fingers traced the edges of Thomas Hartwell's money, counting and recounting the bills that represented their only buffer against complete destitution. Even with Martha Wilson's kindness in providing breakfast and extending their stay, the funds would not last more than a few days. Every calculation led Rebecca back to the same bleak truth. They needed work and fast. But what kind of job could support a woman with 7 children in a struggling frontier town? She was still turning over that impossible question when a soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping children scattered across the small room, and opened the door to find Martha Wilson standing there with a tray of coffee, fresh biscuits, and what looked like homemade berry preserves. Figured you could use this, Martha whispered, nodding toward the hallway. You've got that look folks get when they've spent the night wrestling with worry instead of resting. Rebecca accepted the coffee with grateful hands, inhaling its warmth and richness as if it might temporarily chase away her exhaustion. You're not wrong. Sleep felt like a luxury we couldn't afford not, with so much to figure out. I can't tell you how much your kindness means, but I know we can't impose on you forever. Martha studied her with a discerning eye, the kind that had seen years of transients and tailies pass through her boarding house. Well, she said thoughtfully, leaning against the hallway wall. "I've been thinking since Nathan brought you here. Cedar Falls might not be the easiest place for a woman on her own, especially one with children, but it's not hopeless either. Not for someone with your backbone." Rebecca hesitated, her heart leaping at the hint of possibility. "What are you thinking?" "The school's been in a bit of a bind," Martha said, settling in as though ready to have a longer conversation. "Miss Patterson's been managing alone for months, but with more families moving in, especially minors bringing their children down from the hills, she's stretched too thin. She's mentioned needing help." Rebecca's pulse quickened. Teaching was something she understood, something she had done before her life had been consumed by the care of her orphaned siblings. "Do you think she'd consider taking on an assistant?" "She'd likely jump at the chance," Martha said with a knowing smile. "In fact, she's engaged to the banker's son over in Pueblo and planning to leave as soon as they find a replacement. Problem is, no one wants to take a post this far out, not unless they have a reason to stay." Hope surged in Rebecca's chest for the first time in days. "Do you think the school board would consider me?" "They'd be fools not to," Martha said firmly. "The real question is whether the pay's enough to support your family, and whether this town's ready to accept a teacher with 7 children in tow." Before Rebecca could answer, footsteps on the stairs turned their attention upward. Nathan Coleman appeared, hat in hand, his expression purposeful. "Morning, ladies," he greeted, giving them both a polite nod. "Hope I'm not interrupting. I came by to speak with Mrs. Hayes about some potential opportunities." Martha raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What sort of opportunities?" Nathan hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "The kind that might help a capable woman find her footing in difficult circumstances," he said at last. "Mrs. Hayes, if you're willing, I'd like to take you on a short ride this morning. There are a few people I think you should meet, a few places you might want to see." Rebecca felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity rise in her chest. "What kind of people? What kind of places?" "The kind that might benefit from your strengths," he replied, which answered little but implied a great deal. "I know it's presumptuous of me to get involved, but I have some ideas, possibilities I thought you might not have considered." Martha's nod of approval helped settle Rebecca's nerves. "It can't hurt to hear him out," she said. "With quiet practicality, the children will be just fine here. They've taken a liking to my kitchen, and I could use the help with bread baking." The thought of leaving them, even for a few hours, made Rebecca's chest tighten. Since her sister and brother-in-law had died, she hadn't let the children out of her sight for more than moments at a time. Their care had become so entwined with her identity that imagining herself apart from them, even briefly, felt unnatural. "I understand," Nathan said gently, clearly sensing her hesitation. "But sometimes you need a quiet moment, away from immediate demands, to really think things through. Mrs. Wilson has raised 5 children and helped care for more besides. They'll be in good hands." Rebecca glanced from Martha's steady reassurance to Nathan's earnest expression. Saying no could mean closing a door they couldn't afford to leave shut. "How long would we be gone?" she asked cautiously. "Most of the morning," Nathan admitted. "Maybe into the afternoon, depending on where the conversations lead. But I promise it won't be a waste of your time." His vagueness was both unsettling and intriguing. But before she could second-guess herself, Rebecca found herself nodding. "All right," she said. "I'll go." Perhaps it was the confidence in his manner, or Martha's obvious approval, or simply the desperate need to feel like she was taking action rather than merely reacting to circumstances beyond her control. "All right," she said finally. "Let me check on the children and leave instructions with Mrs. Wilson about their needs." As Rebecca slipped back into the room to gather her shawl and speak quietly to Emma about watching the younger ones, she caught Nathan and Martha exchanging a look that suggested they knew more about the morning's agenda than they were revealing. The thought should have worried her more than it did. But something about Nathan Coleman's steady presence made her feel safer than she had in months. The children were stirring as Rebecca moved quietly around the room, and Emma's eyes opened. Immediately, with the alertness of someone who had learned to wake instantly when circumstances required. "Is everything all right?" the 12-year-old whispered, automatically checking to make sure all her siblings were accounted for. "Everything's fine," Rebecca assured her softly. "I'm going to go with Mr. Coleman to look at some possibilities. For work, Mrs. Wilson will be here with all of you, and I'll be back by dinner time." Emma's expression grew more alert at the mention of work possibilities. "What kind of work?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Rebecca admitted. "But Mr. Coleman seems to think there might be opportunities in Cedar Falls that we haven't considered. I need to investigate every possibility if we're going to make this work." The older girl nodded with the solemn understanding that had characterized her responses to their family's difficulties since their parents' death. "We'll be good for Mrs. Wilson," she promised. "And I'll make sure the little ones don't cause any trouble." Rebecca's heart ached at the way Emma automatically assumed responsibility for her siblings' behavior, as if their acceptance in the community depended on perfect conduct from children who were still adjusting to the trauma of loss and displacement. "You don't have to be perfect," Rebecca said gently, smoothing Emma's dark hair away from her face. "Mrs. Wilson understands that children are children. Just be yourselves and help when she asks." 20 minutes later, Rebecca found herself seated beside Nathan Coleman in a well-maintained wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses, rolling through the streets of Cedar Falls as the town came alive with morning activity. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains and the promise of another warm day ahead. "Where are we going first?" Rebecca asked as they passed the general store where a few early customers were already conducting business. "To see Pastor Miller at the church," Nathan replied, guiding the horses with easy competence. "He's been trying to organize better care for some of the mining families who live too far from town to easily access services. Your arrival might provide solutions to problems he's been wrestling with for months." Rebecca felt a familiar flutter of nervousness at the prospect of being evaluated by yet another stranger who would judge whether she and the children represented assets or liabilities to the community. "What sort of problems?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, apparently considering how much detail to provide. "The mining operation in the hills employs about 30 men, most of them with families. The work is dangerous, and there are frequent injuries that require care. The distance to town means that medical emergencies often become tragedies, and the children miss more school than they attend because of weather and travel difficulties." The picture he painted was sobering, but Rebecca began to see possibilities in the challenges he described. "You think there might be a need for someone to provide services closer to where these families live?" "I think there might be a need for someone with your combination of education, practical experience, and understanding of family dynamics to help address problems that have been growing worse every year," Nathan said carefully. "But I don't want to influence your thinking too much before you've had a chance to hear the situation from Pastor Miller directly." The church sat at the end of Cedar Falls Main Street, a simple wooden building with a tall steeple that pointed toward the morning sky like a prayer made manifest. As they approached, Rebecca could see a man in dark clothes working in a garden beside the building, his movements efficient and purposeful as he tended rows of vegetables that would likely feed families in need throughout the growing season. Pastor Jonathan Miller straightened as their wagon approached, shading his eyes against the morning sun as he recognized Nathan. He was younger than Rebecca had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of steady demeanor that suggested strength without arrogance. His clothes were practical rather than fancy, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who did physical work alongside his spiritual duties. "Nathan," the pastor called in greeting, walking toward them with a welcoming smile. "I was hoping you'd come by today. I heard there was some excitement at the train station yesterday." Nathan helped Rebecca down from the wagon with the courtesy that seemed natural to him, then turned to make introductions. "Pastor Miller, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Rebecca Hayes. She and her children arrived yesterday from Boston, and I thought you might be interested in hearing about her background and circumstances." Pastor Miller's handshake was firm and his smile genuine as he greeted Rebecca. "Mrs. Hayes, welcome to Cedar Falls. I understand your arrival didn't go quite as expected." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at the reminder of Thomas Hartwell's public rejection, but Pastor Miller's tone held sympathy rather than judgment. "No, it certainly didn't. But Mr. Coleman and Mrs. Wilson have been extraordinarily kind in helping us adjust to the unexpected circumstances. Nathan has a gift for seeing possibilities where others see only problems." Pastor Miller agreed, glancing at Nathan with what appeared to be long-standing affection and respect. "Why don't you both come inside? I have coffee brewing, and I'd like to hear more about your situation and your plans." The interior of the church was simple but beautiful, with wooden pews arranged before a modest altar and windows that let in streams of colored light from stained glass that must have cost more than everything else in the building combined. Pastor Miller led them to a small office adjacent to the main sanctuary, where he poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on a small stove. "Nathan tells me you have experience in education," Pastor Miller began once they were all seated with steaming cups in their hands. "What sort of teaching did you do in Boston?" Rebecca felt more comfortable discussing her professional background than her personal circumstances. "I taught at a private academy for young ladies for 3 years before my parents died. Literature, composition, basic mathematics, and what they called domestic arts, though that mostly meant managing household accounts and organizing domestic staff." Pastor Miller's eyebrows rose with obvious interest. "Impressive qualifications. And Nathan mentioned you've been caring for several children since your parents' death." "7 children, actually," Rebecca admitted, watching his face for signs of the dismay that Thomas Hartwell had displayed. "My siblings, orphaned in a factory fire 6 months ago. They range in age from 3 to 12, and they've been my responsibility since the tragedy." To her surprise, Pastor Miller's expression grew more interested rather than concerned. "7 children," he repeated thoughtfully. "All school-aged or approaching school age? Emma is 12 and quite advanced in her studies. Jacob is 10 and remarkably clever with mechanical things. Lily is 8 and loves books above everything else. Samuel is 6 and has never met a problem he couldn't solve with enough determination. Grace is 5 and has a gift for remembering stories and songs. The twins, Rose and Ruby, are 3 and already showing distinct personalities despite their identical appearance." Pastor Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more thoughtful. "Mrs. Hayes, I wonder if Nathan has explained the situation with the mining families in the hills above town?" "He mentioned that distance creates challenges for medical care and education," Rebecca replied carefully. "It's more than challenges," Pastor Miller said seriously. "It's becoming a crisis that threatens the stability of our entire community. The Copper Creek Mining Company employs good men who work hard to support their families, but the isolation of their location means their wives and children live without access to the services that people in town take for granted." Nathan set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "Tell her about the Henderson family situation." Pastor Miller's expression grew somber. "Last winter, Mary Henderson went into labor during a blizzard that made travel to town impossible. Her husband Jim rode 8 hours through dangerous conditions to fetch Dr. Morgan, but by the time they returned, Mary had nearly bled to death. The baby didn't survive, and Mary spent weeks recovering from complications that might have been prevented with proper care." The story sent a chill through Rebecca, both from the tragedy it described and from the recognition of how easily such circumstances could become her own family's reality. How many families live in the mining area? 15 families with children, and the number is growing as the company expands its operations, Pastor Miller replied. The children miss weeks of school during winter months when the roads are impassable, and injuries that should be minor become serious because there's no one with medical training within hours of travel. Nathan looked directly at Rebecca with an expression that suggested he had been building toward this moment since their conversation began. What if there was a way to provide both education and basic medical care closer to where these families live? What if someone with your qualifications could establish a school and clinic that served the mining community directly? The suggestion was so unexpected and ambitious that Rebecca felt momentarily breathless. I have no medical training beyond basic first aid and caring for childhood illnesses. Dr. Morgan has been looking for someone to train as a medical assistant, Pastor Miller said quickly. Someone who could handle routine care and emergencies until proper medical help could arrive. The territorial government has been encouraging such arrangements in remote areas where traditional medical practice isn't feasible. Rebecca's mind raced with the possibilities and challenges such a position would present. Where would such a school and clinic be located? The mining families couldn't afford to pay much for services, and I would need housing for 7 children, plus income enough to support us all. Nathan and Pastor Miller exchanged another of those meaningful looks that suggested they had discussed these details before including Rebecca in the conversation. The mining company has been looking for ways to attract and retain good workers, Nathan explained. Providing better services for their families would be a significant advantage in recruiting skilled miners and keeping them satisfied with their positions. You think they would fund such an arrangement? Rebecca asked, hardly daring to hope for such a comprehensive solution to their difficulties. I think they might be willing to provide housing, basic supplies, and a salary sufficient to support your family in exchange for someone qualified to manage both education and basic medical care for their community, Pastor Miller said carefully. But it would mean living in relative isolation, probably 15 miles from Cedar Falls, with limited contact with town except for supply runs and emergencies. The isolation aspect gave Rebecca pause, but she had lived through enough uncertainty over recent months to know that security and purpose were more valuable than social conveniences. What about the children's education? I could teach them myself, but they need interaction with other children their ages. The mining families have children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, Nathan pointed out. Your siblings would have plenty of peers, and the one-room schoolhouse approach means older children help teach younger ones, which benefits everyone involved. Pastor Miller nodded agreement. And you'd be close enough to bring them to town for church services and community events when weather permitted. It wouldn't be complete isolation. Rebecca found herself seriously considering the proposition despite its challenges and uncertainties. The position would provide everything they needed most desperately: housing, income, purpose, and the opportunity for her to use skills she actually possessed, rather than scrambling to learn new trades under pressure. When would such an arrangement begin? She asked, and both men smiled at the question, clearly interpreting it as serious interest rather than idle curiosity. The mining company's regional supervisor is scheduled to visit Cedar Falls next week, Nathan replied. If you're interested in exploring the possibility, Pastor Miller and I could arrange for you to meet with him and discuss terms. What would I need to do to prepare for such a meeting? Pastor Miller leaned forward with growing enthusiasm. Dr. Morgan could provide basic medical training over the next few days, enough to handle common injuries and illnesses. I have teaching materials and books that could supplement your existing knowledge. And Nathan could take you up to see the mining community so you understand what you'd be committing to. The speed with which solutions were appearing almost made Rebecca suspicious, but she reminded herself that frontier communities often had to create unconventional arrangements to meet their needs. Perhaps Nathan Coleman and Pastor Miller genuinely saw her arrival as an opportunity to solve problems they had been struggling with independently. I would need to see the living conditions and meet some of the families before making any commitments, Rebecca said slowly, and I would want assurance that the children's needs could be met adequately in such an isolated location. Of course, Nathan agreed immediately. We could ride up there this afternoon if you're willing. It's a beautiful location, and I think you'd be surprised by how well established the community has become. Pastor Miller nodded enthusiastically. The miners have built a real settlement, not just a camp. There are proper houses, a general store, even a small chapel. What's missing is the infrastructure of services that makes a place feel like home, rather than just a workplace. As they talked through more details of the potential arrangement, Rebecca found herself imagining what it might be like to build a new life in the mountains, surrounded by families who would value her contributions, rather than seeing her children as burdens. The work would be challenging and the isolation significant, but it offered something she had begun to think was impossible: a genuine fresh start, built on her own abilities rather than dependence on others' charity. There's one more thing you should know, Nathan said as their conversation began to wind down. The mining supervisor, Mr. Garrett, is a practical man who values results over conventional appearances. The fact that you have 7 children might actually work in your favor, since it demonstrates your experience managing complex family situations. The comment reminded Rebecca that she still knew very little about Nathan Coleman's background, or why he was investing so much effort in solving her problems. Mr. Coleman, she said carefully, I hope you don't think me ungrateful, but I'm curious about why you've taken such an interest in our circumstances. You've shown us extraordinary kindness, but we're essentially strangers who stumbled into your community by accident. Nathan's expression grew more serious, and he was quiet for a moment before responding. I suppose it's because I know what it's like to find yourself in a place where everything you planned falls apart, and you have to figure out how to build something new from whatever pieces are left. The pain in his voice suggested personal experience with loss and disappointment, though he didn't offer details about his own circumstances. Rebecca sensed that pressing for more information would be inappropriate, but she appreciated his honesty about having faced similar challenges. Besides, Nathan continued with a slight smile that lightened the mood, this community needs good people who are willing to work hard and contribute to something larger than themselves. From what I've seen, you and your children fit that description perfectly. As they prepared to leave the church, Pastor Miller pressed Rebecca's hands warmly. Whatever you decide about the mining position, please know that you and your children are welcome in Cedar Falls. We may be a small community, but we value people who bring dedication and heart to whatever they undertake. The acceptance in his words was more warming than the morning sunshine, and Rebecca felt some of the tension she had been carrying since their arrival begin to ease. Perhaps Nathan had been right about the community being more welcoming than Thomas Hartwell's rejection had suggested. The ride back to Wilson's boarding house gave Rebecca and Nathan a chance to discuss the morning's revelations more privately. The horses maintained a steady pace through the warming day, and the mountain scenery provided a peaceful backdrop for conversation about practical matters and future possibilities. What did you think of Pastor Miller's proposal? Nathan asked as they navigated a slight rise that offered views of the surrounding valley. It's more ambitious than anything I had imagined, Rebecca admitted. Teaching and basic medical care for an entire community is a significant responsibility. I want to make sure I'm not being overconfident about my abilities or underestimating the challenges. Nathan nodded approvingly. Those are exactly the right concerns to have. Anyone who took on such a position without serious consideration of its demands would be doing a disservice to the families who would depend on them. The isolation worries me less than my qualifications, Rebecca continued. I can teach children effectively, and I've dealt with common childhood illnesses and minor injuries, But what if someone needs medical care beyond my abilities? What if I make the wrong decision and someone suffers because of my ignorance? Dr. Morgan would provide ongoing consultation and would come to the settlement for serious cases, Nathan assured her. And you'd have better communication with town than you might expect. The mining company maintains telegraph lines for business purposes, and they've been talking about extending mail service to improve worker satisfaction. The practical details were reassuring, but Rebecca found herself wondering about other aspects of the potential arrangement. What about you? She asked impulsively, then felt her cheeks warm at the personal nature of the question. I mean, you seem very invested in helping us find a suitable situation. Would we see you occasionally if we moved to the mining settlement? Nathan's hands tightened slightly on the reins, though his expression remained calm. I have business dealings with the mining company, so I ride up there fairly regularly to check on supply deliveries and equipment maintenance. And I've been helping Pastor Miller with some of the community support efforts, so I'd probably continue to be involved in whatever services develop for the families. The answer was practical and professional, but something in his tone suggested there might be more personal interest behind his involvement than he was admitting. Rebecca found the possibility both comforting and slightly unsettling, since she was not ready to consider romantic complications while still establishing basic security for her family. As they approached Wilson's boarding house, Rebecca could see children playing in the side yard under Martha Wilson's supervision. Emma was showing Lily how to tend a small garden plot, while Jacob appeared to be constructing something elaborate from scraps of wood and rope. The twins were chasing Samuel around a tree while Grace sat nearby, absorbed in what appeared to be a picture book. The sight of her siblings engaged in normal childhood activities, looking relaxed and content for the first time in months, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. This was what she wanted for them: safety, stability, and the opportunity to be children, rather than refugees constantly adjusting to new circumstances and adult anxieties. They look happy, Nathan observed, apparently noticing the same scene that had affected Rebecca so strongly. They look like children instead of worried little adults, Rebecca replied, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. It's been so long since I've seen them play without watching for signs that we might need to pack up and leave again. Nathan brought the wagon to a stop near the boarding house but made no immediate move to help Rebecca down. Instead, he turned to face her with an expression that was both serious and gentle. Mrs. Hayes, he said quietly, I want you to know that whatever decision you make about the mining position or any other opportunity, you and those children have a place in this community. Cedar Falls may not be perfect, but it's the kind of place where people help each other through difficult times. The simple statement carried more emotional weight than elaborate promises might have done. Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety and defensive tension that she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. Thank you, she said simply, though the words felt inadequate for everything Nathan Coleman had done for them in less than 24 hours. For the kindness, for the opportunities, for treating us like people with value rather than problems to be solved. Nathan smiled, and the expression transformed his serious features in a way that made Rebecca's heart flutter with something she was not quite ready to examine closely. Everyone has value, Mrs. Hayes. Sometimes it just takes the right circumstances for people to recognize it. As he helped her down from the wagon and they walked toward the boarding house together, Rebecca found herself thinking that perhaps the most important recognition was beginning to happen within herself. For the first time since her parents' death, she was beginning to see possibilities for the future that extended beyond mere survival into something that might actually resemble the life she had once hoped to build. 3 weeks had passed since Rebecca Hayes arrived in Cedar Falls, and the transformation in her circumstances seemed almost miraculous. What had begun as a devastating rejection at the train station had evolved into the most promising opportunity she had ever encountered. The mining settlement position had materialized into reality with surprising speed once Mr. Garrett, the regional supervisor, met Rebecca and witnessed her competence firsthand. Within days of their initial meeting, she had signed a contract that provided housing, supplies, and a salary that would support her family, while allowing her to establish both a school and basic medical clinic for the isolated community. Children had adapted to their temporary life at Wilson's boarding house with remarkable resilience, forming friendships with local youngsters and helping Martha Wilson with daily tasks that made them feel useful rather than burdensome. Emma had proven particularly valuable in the kitchen, her careful attention to detail making her an ideal assistant for the complex meals required to feed a boarding house full of guests. Jacob had appointed himself Martha's unofficial maintenance helper, repairing loose hinges and wobbly furniture with the mechanical aptitude that seemed to run in his family. Even the youngest children had found their places in the temporary routine, with the twins becoming Martha's shadows and Grace enchanting everyone with her ability to memorize and recite lengthy poems after hearing them only once. Rebecca spent her mornings training with Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, learning to treat common injuries and illnesses that might arise in an isolated mining community. The sessions were intensive and sometimes overwhelming, covering everything from setting broken bones to recognizing signs of serious illness that would require immediate evacuation to town. Dr. Morgan was a woman of remarkable competence who had earned her medical degree in Philadelphia before following her husband west, and she approached Rebecca's training with the same thorough professionalism she brought to her regular practice. The key to frontier medicine, Dr. Morgan explained as she demonstrated proper bandaging techniques on a practice dummy, is knowing the limits of your abilities and having systems in place for situations that exceed those limits. You're not trying to become a doctor in 3 weeks, Mrs. Hayes. You're learning to provide competent care until proper medical help can arrive. Rebecca absorbed every detail with the focused intensity she had once applied to literature and composition, understanding that lives might depend on her ability to apply these lessons correctly under pressure. The responsibility was sobering, but it also provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since her parents' death. Her afternoons were spent with Pastor Miller, reviewing curriculum materials and educational strategies for managing a one-room schoolhouse that would serve children ranging from barely literate to nearly ready for advanced studies. The challenge of teaching multiple age groups simultaneously was familiar from her previous experience, but doing so in isolation with limited resources would require creativity and flexibility she had never needed before. The older children will be your greatest assets, Pastor Miller explained as they organized books and supplies that would accompany Rebecca to the mining settlement. Emma is clearly capable of helping with the younger students, and from what I've observed, Jacob has natural leadership abilities that could be channeled into mentoring responsibilities. The observation was accurate, and Rebecca had already begun thinking about ways to structure the school environment so that teaching and learning became collaborative efforts rather than one-way transfers of information from instructor to student. The mining children she had met during her visits to the settlement were bright and eager to learn, though their education had been sporadic due to the practical demands of frontier life. It was during one of these planning sessions that Rebecca first encountered the opposition that would soon threaten everything she had worked to build. She was leaving the church after a particularly productive afternoon when she noticed a small group of well-dressed women gathered near the general store, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw her approaching. Margaret Thornton stepped forward from the group, her elegant bearing and expensive clothes marking her as someone of significant social standing in the community. Rebecca recognized her as the widow of a prominent rancher, though they had not been formally introduced during her weeks in Cedar Falls. Mrs. Thornton's expression was polite but cool, the kind of controlled courtesy that often preceded criticism or rejection. "Mrs. Hayes," Margaret Thornton said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I wonder if I might have a word with you. We've been hearing quite a lot about your plans for the mining settlement, and some of us have concerns about the precedent such an arrangement might set." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety, though she forced herself to maintain a calm demeanor. "What sort of concerns, Mrs. Thornton?" "Well," Margaret continued, glancing at her companions for support, "it seems unusual for an unmarried woman with so many dependents to be placed in such an important position. The mining families deserve qualified professionals, not someone who might be overwhelmed by personal responsibilities." The criticism was delivered with polite language, but its intent was unmistakable. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she kept her voice level when she responded. "I appreciate your concern for the mining families, Mrs. Thornton. I share your desire to ensure they receive the best possible services." "I'm sure you mean well," Margaret replied dismissively, "but good intentions aren't sufficient when dealing with medical emergencies or children's education. These are serious responsibilities that require undivided attention and proven expertise." One of Margaret's companions, a thin woman with sharp features who introduced herself as Mrs. Campbell, nodded agreement. "We've spoken with several community leaders about our concerns. It seems premature to commit to such an important arrangement without exploring all available options." Rebecca understood the subtext clearly. These women were organizing opposition to her appointment, questioning her qualifications and suitability for reasons that had more to do with social prejudices than professional competence. The familiar pattern of rejection was beginning to repeat itself, though this time she had more invested in the outcome. "What alternatives would you suggest?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious about what solutions they might propose. "Margaret." Thornton's expression grew more confident, as if she had been waiting for exactly this question. "The territorial government has been recruiting qualified teachers and medical personnel for frontier communities. Surely it would be better to wait for properly credentialed professionals rather than rushing into an arrangement that might prove inadequate. And in the meantime?" Rebecca prompted. "While we wait for these ideal candidates to appear, what happens to the children who are missing months of education and the families who face medical emergencies without any trained assistance?" The question seemed to catch Margaret off guard, as if she hadn't considered the practical implications of delaying services while waiting for perfect solutions. "Well, naturally we wouldn't want anyone to suffer," she said less confidently. "But surely a few more months wouldn't make a significant difference." Rebecca felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of the mining family's needs, but she controlled her response carefully. "Mrs. Thornton, have you visited the mining settlement? Have you spoken with the families about their circumstances and needs?" "I don't see what that has to do with the question of your qualifications," Margaret replied stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with having her assumptions challenged. "It has everything to do with it," Rebecca said firmly. "Those families need help now, not theoretical perfect solutions that may never materialize. I may not have formal credentials, but I have practical experience, genuine commitment, and most importantly, I'm actually here and willing to do the work." The conversation attracted attention from other townspeople, and Rebecca noticed several faces she recognized from her weeks in Cedar Falls. Some expressions showed support and encouragement, while others reflected the uncertainty and doubt that Margaret Thornton was trying to cultivate. "Mrs. Hayes," called a familiar voice from across the street. Nathan Coleman was approaching with his characteristic confident stride, his expression suggesting he had overheard enough of the conversation to understand its nature. "I hope these ladies aren't bothering you with unnecessary worries about your new position." Margaret Thornton's demeanor shifted noticeably at Nathan's arrival, her posture becoming more formal and her smile more forced. "Nathan," she said with obvious discomfort, "we were simply expressing some concerns about the mining settlement arrangement. Surely you understand the importance of ensuring adequate services for those families." Nathan's gaze moved between Margaret and Rebecca, and his expression suggested he understood exactly what type of concerns were being expressed. I understand the importance of supporting someone who's willing to provide desperately needed services rather than criticizing. From the sidelines, he replied coolly. Mrs. Hayes has more practical qualifications for this position than anyone else we're likely to find. But Nathan, Margaret persisted, her voice taking on a slightly pleading tone that suggested their relationship had some history. Rebecca didn't understand. Surely you can see the risks of placing so much responsibility on someone with so many personal obligations. What if family emergencies interfere with her professional duties? Nathan's expression grew harder, and Rebecca sensed undercurrents in the conversation that went beyond concerns about her qualifications. What I see, Nathan said deliberately, is a capable woman being criticized by people who have never volunteered to solve the problems they're so worried about. The exchange was growing increasingly tense, and Rebecca decided to intervene before it escalated into open conflict. Mrs. Thornton, she said quietly, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate that they come from genuine care for the community's welfare. If you have specific suggestions for improving the arrangement or addressing potential problems, I'd be happy to discuss them. Margaret Thornton's expression suggested she had expected defensiveness or anger rather than reasonable dialogue. And Rebecca's calm response seemed to deflate some of her confrontational energy. Well, she said less certainly, I suppose we could discuss ways to provide additional oversight or support for your efforts. What kind of oversight? Nathan asked, his tone suggesting he suspected Margaret's motivations were not entirely altruistic. Perhaps a committee of community leaders could review Mrs. Hayes' progress periodically, Margaret suggested, to ensure that standards are being maintained and that any problems are addressed promptly. Rebecca considered the proposal, recognizing both its potential benefits and its likely drawbacks. Community support could be valuable, but oversight by people who doubted her abilities might create more problems than it solved. What would such oversight involve? She asked carefully. Regular reports on educational progress and medical cases, Mrs. Campbell interjected eagerly, apparently seeing an opportunity to establish some control over Rebecca's activities. Documentation of how you're managing both professional and personal responsibilities. Evidence that the children's needs aren't interfering with your duties to the mining families. The requirements sounded reasonable on the surface, but Rebecca recognized them as potentially burdensome bureaucracy designed to create opportunities for criticism and interference. Still, she was reluctant to reject any proposal that might build community support for her position. I would be willing to provide regular reports on the school's progress and general information about medical services, she said diplomatically, though patient confidentiality would limit how much detail I could share about specific medical cases. Nathan looked skeptical about the entire proposal, but before he could voice objections, Pastor Miller appeared from the direction of the church, apparently drawn by the crowd that had gathered around their conversation. Good afternoon, everyone, Pastor Miller said pleasantly, though his eyes showed awareness that some kind of tension was developing. I hope there isn't a problem with our mining settlement plans. Margaret Thornton seized the opportunity to present her concerns to another community leader. Pastor Miller, we've been discussing some reservations about placing so much responsibility on Mrs. Hayes without proper oversight or support systems. Pastor Miller's expression grew more serious as he looked between the various participants in the conversation. What sort of reservations, Margaret? The question of whether someone with 7 children can adequately serve an entire mining community, Mrs. Campbell said bluntly, and whether we should commit to such an arrangement without exploring other options. Pastor Miller was quiet for a moment, apparently considering his response carefully. When he spoke, his tone was measured but firm. I've worked with Mrs. Hayes extensively over the past 3 weeks, and I've been consistently impressed by her competence, dedication, and practical wisdom. The mining families desperately need the services she's prepared to provide. But surely you can see the concerns about her situation, Margaret pressed. 7 children represent significant demands on her time and attention. What happens when her family needs conflict with her professional responsibilities? What happens, said a new voice from the edge of the gathering, is that children learn responsibility and community service by watching adults who embody those values. Everyone turned to see Dr. Morgan approaching, her medical bag in hand, and her expression suggesting she had overheard enough of the conversation to form opinions about its direction. As one of the most respected professionals in Cedar Falls, her intervention carried considerable weight. "Dr. Morgan," Margaret Thornton said with obvious discomfort, "we were just discussing the mining settlement arrangement and whether additional oversight might be beneficial. I've been training Mrs. Hayes in basic medical procedures," Dr. Morgan said coolly, "and I can attest to her intelligence, thoroughness, and judgment. She's learned more in 3 weeks than some of my previous assistants absorbed in 3 months. The professional endorsement clearly surprised Margaret and her supporters, who had apparently assumed that Dr. Morgan would share their concerns about Rebecca's unconventional circumstances. "But the question of divided loyalties remains," Mrs. Campbell insisted stubbornly. Dr. Morgan's expression grew stern. "The question of community need should take precedence over theoretical concerns about divided loyalties. Those mining families have been without adequate medical care for years while we've debated perfect solutions that never materialize." The conversation was drawing more observers, and Rebecca noticed that public opinion seemed to be shifting in response to the professional endorsements from Pastor Miller and Dr. Morgan. Several people she recognized from her weeks in town were nodding agreement with the arguments in her favor. Sheriff Robert Carter emerged from the group of onlookers, his presence adding another layer of authority to the discussion. "Seems to me," the sheriff said in his calm, authoritative voice, "that we've got someone willing to solve problems that have been festering for years. Might be worth supporting that instead of creating new problems." Margaret Thornton's expression grew increasingly frustrated as more community leaders aligned themselves with Rebecca's position. "I'm not trying to create problems," she said defensively. "I'm simply advocating for proper standards and procedures." "What standards?" Nathan asked pointedly. "What procedures?" "You're talking about theoretical concerns while ignoring practical realities that are affecting real families right now." The challenge seemed to galvanize Margaret's resolve, and her voice grew sharper. "The standard of ensuring that critical community services are provided by people whose primary loyalties aren't divided by personal obligations. The procedure of thoroughly vetting candidates before placing them in positions of such responsibility." Rebecca felt the conversation slipping into personal attack territory and decided to address the underlying issues directly. "Mrs. Thornton," she said clearly, "I understand that my circumstances are unusual, and I don't expect everyone to be comfortable with unconventional arrangements. But I would ask you to consider the results rather than the appearance." "What results?" Margaret demanded. "You haven't even begun the position yet. The result of 7 children who have learned to work together, support each other, and contribute to whatever community they join," Rebecca replied firmly. "The result of practical experience managing complex family dynamics under difficult circumstances. The result of someone who understands that service to others requires sacrifice and commitment." Pastor Miller nodded approvingly. "Wilson say whether he gave a name?" Emma shook her head. She asked, but he just said he was acting under official authority. "He's got a suit, kind of dusty like he's been traveling, and a leather satchel with papers, but he wouldn't let her see them properly." Nathan immediately straightened, all trace of his earlier calm gone. "Let's go," he said. "We'll sort this out right now." Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. She nodded and fell into step beside Nathan as they followed Emma down the dirt road. The gentle hum of a community returning to its daily rhythm, contrasting sharply with the storm building in her mind. She glanced sideways at Nathan. "Do you think it could be someone from Boston, from the courts?" "It's possible," Nathan said, scanning the street ahead as they moved quickly. "But if it is, he has no legal standing here without documentation. And if he's using intimidation instead of process, that tells me something's off already." By the time they reached Wilson's boarding house, Rebecca could see Mrs. Wilson standing on the porch, her mouth tight with tension and her arms folded across her chest. A tall man in a travel-worn jacket stood near the doorway, his back to them. He turned when they approached, revealing a face more polished than the rest of him, sharp-featured, and framed by wire-rimmed spectacles that gleamed in the midday sun. "You must be Mrs. Hayes," the man said, adjusting his glasses as his gaze flicked briefly to Nathan and then back to her. "My name is Mr. Harrow. I've been sent by the Massachusetts Office of Domestic Affairs in cooperation with the Territorial Clerk's Office. I'm following up on reports concerning the relocation of minor dependents across state lines without formal guardianship documentation." Rebecca felt her knees weaken slightly but stood tall. "These children are my kin," she said clearly. "Their parents named me guardian in their will. I've raised them since the day they died." Harrow's expression didn't change. "And yet no legal guardianship paperwork has been filed with the Massachusetts court system, which means, officially, the children are wards of the state, until such time as custody is legally established." Nathan stepped forward, his voice like iron under silk. "And what jurisdiction do you believe you have in Colorado territory, Mr. Harrow? Because unless you've coordinated with Judge Barton or filed a request through the territorial courts, your authority ends the moment you cross the state line." For the first time, Harrow's confidence faltered slightly. "I'm not here to remove the children, Mr. Coleman," Nathan said, crossing his arms. "Deputy Land Commissioner. And I'm well acquainted with how jurisdiction works out here." "I'm only here to collect information and report back," Harrow insisted. "But I must advise Mrs. Hayes that without legal proof of guardianship, her position is precarious. There are individuals back east, extended family members who are expressing concern." Rebecca's voice came out colder than she'd intended. "They had no concern when the children needed a home. Not one of them offered shelter. They were only too happy to let me take them when there was nothing to gain. What's changed now?" Harrow adjusted his satchel again, clearly uncomfortable. "There's been talk of inheritance issues and questions about propriety. You did, after all, leave the state without informing the appropriate agencies." Rebecca's blood chilled at the word inheritance. There was no money left, at least none she'd seen. But she wouldn't put it past one of her distant relatives to use the possibility as an excuse to seize control. Nathan stepped forward, again squaring off with Harrow. "If you want a formal interview, you can request one through the town clerk. Until then, Mrs. Hayes is under the protection of this community and the authority of our territorial jurisdiction. And if you try to approach her or the children again without documentation, you'll be escorted to the next train out of Cedar Falls." Mrs. Wilson gave an approving grunt from the porch. Harrow's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll make my report. I expect to be in touch soon." "You do that," Nathan said. The man turned and walked briskly down the street, the dust rising behind his boots. Rebecca released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I knew it wasn't over," she murmured. Nathan looked at her, his voice gentler now. "Then we stay ready. And we fight it, together. You're not alone in this anymore, Rebecca." Rebecca watched Harrow disappear down the road and reached for Emma's hand. "No," she said quietly. "We're not." "Wilson get his name?" Emma shook her head. "He wouldn't give it. Just said he was investigating reports about children in irregular circumstances." The phrase irregular circumstances sent a chill through Rebecca, that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had heard similar language used by officials in Boston who questioned whether a young unmarried woman was suitable to care for 7 orphaned children, and the memory of those interactions filled her with dread about what this new investigation might bring. "We should get back to the boarding house immediately," Nathan said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling crises. "Whatever this man wants, it's better to address it directly than to let him draw his own conclusions from incomplete information." As they hurried through the streets of Cedar Falls, Rebecca's mind raced with possibilities about what could have brought territorial officials to investigate their circumstances. Had someone reported concerns about her fitness as a guardian? Was there some legal challenge to her custody of the children? Had Thomas Hartwell or Margaret Thornton complained to authorities about their presence in the community? The questions multiplied with each step, and Rebecca found herself preparing mentally for another crisis that might shatter the fragile stability they had finally begun to build. The timing couldn't have been worse, coming just as she was about to begin the mining settlement position that promised real security and purpose for her family. Nathan seemed to sense her growing anxiety and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they approached Wilson's boarding house. "Whatever this is about," he said firmly, "you're not facing it alone. This community has invested in your success, and will stand behind you if there are challenges to address." The support in his voice was comforting, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully constructed new life was about to face its most serious test. As they climbed the steps to the boarding house porch, she steeled herself for whatever confrontation awaited inside, hoping that the relationships and alliances she had built over the past 3 weeks would prove strong enough to withstand whatever storm was approaching. The man waiting in Martha Wilson's parlor was tall and thin, with the kind of sharp features that seemed designed for scrutiny and judgment. His dark suit was well-tailored but travel-worn, and he held a leather portfolio that spoke of official business conducted far from comfortable offices. When Rebecca entered the room with Nathan and Emma, the stranger's pale eyes assessed them with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating people for compliance with regulations they might not even understand. "Mrs. Hayes, I presume," the man said without rising from his chair, his tone carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate cooperation. "I am Inspector Charles Whitmore from the Territorial Child Welfare Division. I've been sent to investigate reports concerning the circumstances of several minor children currently in your care." Rebecca felt the familiar cold dread that had accompanied every official interaction since her parents' death, but she forced herself to remain calm and dignified. "What sort of reports, Mr. Whitmore, and from whom?" Inspector Whitmore opened his portfolio and withdrew a stack of papers that appeared to contain official forms and correspondence. "Anonymous concerns have been raised about the suitability of your guardianship arrangement and the propriety of your current living situation. The territorial government takes such matters very seriously, particularly when they involve children who may be vulnerable to neglect or improper influences." Nathan stepped closer to Rebecca, his presence a wordless declaration of support that did not go unnoticed by the inspector. "By what authority are you conducting this investigation?" Nathan asked firmly. "Mrs. Hayes has legal guardianship of these children, established through proper Massachusetts probate proceedings." Inspector Whitmore's expression grew colder, if possible, as he turned his attention to Nathan. "And you are?" "Nathan Coleman, a friend of Mrs. Hayes and a longtime resident of Cedar Falls," Nathan replied steadily. "I'm curious about the nature of these anonymous reports and why they've prompted territorial intervention in what appears to be a private family matter." The inspector made a notation in a small leather book he produced from his vest pocket. "Mr. Coleman, your friendship with Mrs. Hayes may itself be relevant to our investigation. Anonymous sources have suggested that Mrs. Hayes has been engaging in inappropriate relationships that compromise her ability to provide proper moral guidance for 7 impressionable children." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire, acrid and choking. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger at the implications being drawn from her perfectly respectable interactions with community members who had shown her kindness. "Inspector Whitmore," Rebecca said with careful control, "I would appreciate knowing the specific nature of these accusations so that I can respond to them directly. Vague implications serve no one's interests, least of all the children's." Martha Wilson appeared in the parlor doorway, her expression thunderous as she took in the scene. "Inspector," she said with barely concealed hostility, "Mrs. Hayes and her children have been model guests in my establishment. If someone has been spreading malicious gossip about this family, they're lying through their teeth." Inspector Whitmore glanced at Martha with the dismissive attention he might pay to an insect. "Mrs. Wilson, is it? Your testimony regarding Mrs. Hayes' character will be noted, though your obvious partiality may limit its relevance to our investigation." The casual dismissal of Martha's support seemed to galvanize something in the older woman, and she stepped fully into the room with the bearing of someone prepared for battle. "Partiality toward decent people is something I'm proud to claim," Martha declared. "And if you think you can come into my establishment and make accusations against a woman who's shown nothing but devotion to those children, you're sadly mistaken about the kind of community Cedar Falls represents." Before Inspector Whitmore could respond to Martha's defense, the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the children, who had apparently grown curious about the commotion in the parlor. Emma appeared first, followed by Jacob and Lily, with the younger children clustering behind them, in the protective formation they had perfected during months of uncertainty. Inspector Whitmore's gaze sharpened as he studied the children, his attention moving from face to face with the systematic approach of someone cataloging evidence. "These would be the minors in question," he said, withdrawing what appeared to be a list from his portfolio. "Emma, Jacob, Lily, Samuel, Grace, Rose, and Ruby Hayes, ranging in age from 3 to 12 years. The clinical recitation of their names and ages made the children sound like inventory rather than human beings, and Rebecca saw Emma's jaw tighten with the same protective anger that had sustained them through their darkest months in Boston. "We're not in question," Emma said clearly, her 12-year-old voice carrying the dignity that seemed to surprise the inspector. "We're a family, and Rebecca is taking proper care of all of us." Inspector Whitmore made another notation in his book. "Child, your opinions about your care arrangement are noted, though minors are not considered competent to evaluate the adequacy of their own supervision." The dismissive response seemed to sting Emma, whose educational achievements and mature responsibilities had earned her respect from every adult she had encountered in Cedar Falls. Jacob stepped forward to stand beside his sister, his 10-year-old face set in lines of stubborn defiance. "Rebecca taught us to read and write and cipher numbers," Jacob declared. "She makes sure we eat proper meals and say our prayers and learn right from wrong. What more is a guardian supposed to do?" "Inspector." Whitmore's expression suggested that Jacob's question was irrelevant to whatever criteria he was applying to their situation. "The territorial government requires that children in irregular circumstances receive supervision that meets established standards for moral guidance, educational development, and social propriety. Anonymous reports suggest that Mrs. Hayes' current arrangements may be deficient in one or more of these areas." Nathan's expression grew darker as the inspector continued his recitation of vague accusations. "What specific deficiencies are being alleged?" Nathan demanded. "And who made these anonymous reports?" "The source of legitimate concerns is protected by territorial regulations," Inspector Whitmore replied smoothly. "As for specific allegations, they include questions about Mrs. Hayes' moral character based on her cohabitation arrangements, concerns about the children's educational development in an irregular household situation, and doubts about her ability to provide proper supervision while pursuing employment that would take her away from her guardianship responsibilities. Rebecca felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as the inspector outlined accusations that seemed designed to address every aspect of the life she had built in Cedar Falls. Someone with detailed knowledge of her circumstances had crafted complaints specifically intended to undermine her guardianship and her mining settlement position simultaneously. "These allegations are completely false," Rebecca said firmly. "I have maintained entirely proper living arrangements, provided consistent education and guidance for the children, and accepted employment that will actually enhance my ability to support my family while serving community needs." Inspector Whitmore consulted his notes again. "Mrs. Hayes, territorial records show that you arrived in Cedar Falls under circumstances involving a failed marriage arrangement with one Thomas Hartwell. Anonymous sources suggest that your subsequent relationships with various male community members have created an environment of moral ambiguity inappropriate for children's development." The accusation was so twisted and unfair that Rebecca momentarily lost her ability to respond coherently. Her relationships with various male community members consisted of professional training with Dr. Morgan and Pastor Miller, plus Nathan Coleman's friendship and assistance. To characterize these interactions as morally compromising revealed either stunning ignorance or deliberate malice. Nathan's voice was dangerously quiet when he spoke. "Inspector Whitmore, if you're suggesting that Mrs. Hayes has behaved improperly in any way, you're not only wrong but offensive. This woman has shown more integrity and dedication than anyone I've ever met." "Mr. Coleman," the inspector replied with a thin smile, "your vigorous defense of Mrs. Hayes only reinforces concerns about the nature of your relationship and its potential impact on her judgment regarding the children's welfare." The circular logic was maddening, turning every expression of support into evidence of impropriety and every defense into confirmation of wrongdoing. Rebecca realized that Inspector Whitmore had arrived with conclusions already formed and was now collecting whatever information could be shaped to support predetermined findings. "What exactly is the territorial government proposing?" Inspector Whitmore did not respond immediately. His pen hovered above the page, tapping lightly as he considered the mounting wall of testimony forming around Rebecca. His expression betrayed none of his thoughts, but his silence was telling. Sheriff Carter broke it. "With respect, Inspector, if you're here in the name of protecting children, maybe it's time to consider whether disrupting a thriving family does more harm than good." Whitmore finally looked up. "My task is not to pass judgment based on sentiment. I must determine whether the current arrangement aligns with territorial regulations and the long-term welfare of the minors involved." "But you're hearing from the town's doctor and pastor," Nathan said steadily. "People who know these children personally, not from a stack of forms or institutional reports. Shouldn't that count for something?" Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "What counts is verified compliance. Emotional testimonials are useful, but not definitive. Still," he glanced at Rebecca, "if a formalized structure could be implemented, one that ensures proper schooling, consistent supervision during your working hours, and periodic evaluations by an impartial party, then perhaps a compromise could be considered." Rebecca seized on that faint thread of opportunity. "I could employ a local caretaker during the hours I'm serving in the settlement, someone the town approves. And I would agree to regular home visits by a designated official, Dr. Morgan, for instance." Dr. Morgan nodded immediately. "I'd be more than willing to provide quarterly evaluations. I already see the children regularly and can submit reports on their development. And I can speak with the school board," Pastor Miller added. "Ensure their education meets or exceeds the standards set by the territory. They've already demonstrated academic progress under Rebecca's supervision." Whitmore scribbled a few more lines, his face unreadable. "If such an arrangement were put into writing and formally submitted for review, I would be obligated to consider it as a viable alternative to institutional placement. Rebecca stood straighter. "Then that's what we'll do." Emma let out a quiet breath beside her, and Lily clutched her hand tightly. Behind them, Martha Wilson gave a small nod of satisfaction, as if daring Whitmore to contradict the strength of what had just been built around this fragile family. For a long moment, the inspector simply stood there, the weight of all their eyes pressing on him. Then, with a crisp snap, he closed his notebook. "I will expect documentation within 1 week," he said. "If your proposed structure proves satisfactory, no further action will be taken pending future compliance." And with that, he turned and strode from the parlor, leaving behind the heavy silence of a battle narrowly won. Rebecca didn't speak until the sound of the front door closing echoed through the house. Then she sagged slightly, her hand still clutching Lily's. "I thought we might lose them," she whispered. "You didn't," Dr. Morgan said firmly. "Because you fought, and because this town sees what's true." Nathan stepped closer, his voice low and certain. "This isn't the end, but it's a start. And you've got allies now, Rebecca. You're not alone." She nodded, meeting his gaze. For the first time in weeks, she believed it. Sheriff Carter crossed his arms and fixed Inspector Whitmore with the steady gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats to community stability. "Inspector, I've been keeping an eye on this family since they arrived in Cedar Falls. I've seen no evidence of any problems that would justify territorial intervention." The arrival of multiple community leaders clearly frustrated Inspector Whitmore's plans for a straightforward investigation based on anonymous complaints. He made rapid notations in his book while apparently reconsidering his approach to the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the inspector said with forced patience, "your community support for Mrs. Hayes is noted and appreciated. However, the territorial government cannot base child welfare decisions on local popularity or personal friendships." Dr. Morgan stepped closer to the inspector, her professional authority evident in every line of her posture. "Inspector Whitmore, are you qualified to evaluate medical evidence regarding children's welfare?" "Because I am, and I'm telling you that these children are receiving superior care under Rebecca Hayes' guardianship." The direct challenge to his expertise seemed to rattle Inspector Whitmore's composure slightly. "Dr. Morgan, medical care is only one aspect of adequate guardianship. The territorial government must consider educational, moral, and social factors as well, all of which are being addressed excellently," Pastor Miller interjected firmly. "Mrs. Hayes has developed educational plans that exceed territorial requirements, provided consistent moral guidance based on sound principles, and integrated these children into community life in ways that benefit everyone involved." Sheriff Carter nodded agreement. "Inspector, what exactly are you proposing to do here? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're trying to solve problems that don't exist." Inspector Whitmore's expression grew more defensive as he faced unified opposition from Cedar Falls leadership. "Sheriff Carter, the territorial government has received serious allegations about Mrs. Hayes' fitness as a guardian. These allegations must be investigated thoroughly regardless of local opinions." "What allegations specifically?" Sheriff Carter demanded. "And from whom? Because if someone's been making false reports about this family, that's a crime I'm interested in investigating." The inspector's hesitation suggested that he was not prepared for law enforcement scrutiny of his sources or methods. "Sheriff, the confidentiality of legitimate complainants is protected by territorial regulations." "Legitimate complainants, yes," Sheriff Carter agreed. "But false accusations and malicious reports aren't protected by anything except the cowardice of people who won't stand behind their words." Rebecca watched this exchange with growing hope that community support might be enough to counter whatever forces had initiated the investigation. However, she also recognized that Inspector Whitmore retained significant power to disrupt their lives regardless of local opposition. "Inspector," she said quietly, drawing attention back to herself, "what would it take to resolve these concerns definitively?" What proof would satisfy the territorial government that my guardianship is appropriate and should continue? Inspector Whitmore studied her for a long moment, apparently weighing his options in light of the unexpected community resistance he had encountered. Mrs. Hayes, the most straightforward resolution would involve changes to your living and employment arrangements that address the specific concerns that have been raised. What sort of changes? Nathan asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer would be unreasonable. Mrs. Hayes would need to establish a more conventional household arrangement with proper supervision, the inspector replied. Her employment plans would need to be modified to ensure adequate attention to her guardianship responsibilities, and she would need to demonstrate ongoing compliance with territorial standards through regular reporting and inspection. The requirements sounded bureaucratic and invasive, but Rebecca was prepared to accept almost any conditions that would keep her family together. I would be willing to make reasonable adjustments to address legitimate concerns, she said carefully. What sort of adjustments would be considered adequate? Dr. Morgan asked, apparently sensing the same trap that Rebecca was trying to navigate. Inspector Whitmore consulted his notes again. The most significant concern involves Mrs. Hayes' proposed employment in an isolated location where proper supervision of 7 children would be difficult to maintain. Alternative employment that allowed for more conventional family arrangements would address many of the allegations. Rebecca felt her heart sink as she realized that the inspector was essentially demanding that she abandon the mining settlement position that represented her family's best hope for economic security and meaningful work. The coincidence of timing suggested that whoever had initiated this investigation understood exactly what they were trying to destroy. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Miss Thornton," he said cautiously, "you are not part of this official investigation. I suggest you—" "I am part of what prompted it," Margaret interrupted, her voice tighter than usual, betraying the strain she was under. "And I think it's time I clarified the scope of my concerns and my role in bringing them to your attention." A ripple of confusion passed through the room, though Rebecca's stomach sank with understanding. She had suspected Margaret's influence behind Whitmore's arrival, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. The man beside Margaret cleared his throat awkwardly. "Inspector Whitmore, I'm Horace Delaney. I manage clerical coordination at the Pueblo Administrative Office. Miss Thornton brought concerns to our attention several weeks ago, unofficially at first. Given her family's social standing and the unusual circumstances surrounding Mrs. Hayes' guardianship, those concerns were eventually elevated." Rebecca went still. "This was never about protecting the children," she said softly. "It was about punishing me for disrupting your expectations." Margaret's cheeks flushed. "You arrived here with no formal connections, no husband, and a swarm of children, not just surviving but gaining the town's respect and Nathan's attention." Her voice wavered, the mask slipping further. "You don't understand the balance we've worked to maintain here, what this community values." "I think we do understand," Nathan said, his voice like ice. "We value integrity, courage, and the strength it takes to protect those who have no one else. What we don't value is small-minded interference wrapped in social politeness." Margaret's lip trembled for a moment before she looked away. "I never intended for the children to be harmed. I only wanted—" She cut herself off, unable to finish the sentence as shame finally began to surface behind her tightly composed expression. Inspector Whitmore turned to Delaney, irritation written plainly across his face. "Why wasn't I informed that this investigation originated from a private citizen's complaint based on personal entanglements?" Delaney fidgeted. "Because it wasn't formalized until it passed through a secondary review. By then it had the appearance of procedural legitimacy." "You were manipulated," Pastor Miller said quietly. "And now you're face to face with the people that manipulation would have hurt." Whitmore's jaw clenched. For the first time, his expression suggested not just bureaucratic discomfort, but personal anger, perhaps at being used, perhaps at being publicly exposed. He took a slow breath, then turned toward Rebecca and the children. Mrs. Hayes, I will file a preliminary report noting that the community has demonstrated unified support for your guardianship, that no evidence of neglect or instability has been found, and that territorial officials acted based on misrepresented concerns. I will also recommend no further action pending an official review should one ever be requested again. Rebecca exhaled shakily, nodding. Thank you, Inspector. He adjusted his coat stiffly. You will still be required to submit a basic guardianship documentation packet for formal record keeping, but I see no further cause for intervention. With a final glance, half apologetic, half defensive, Whitmore turned and exited the parlor. Margaret stood alone now, her earlier confidence deflated. Martha Wilson looked her up and down with thinly veiled contempt. You should be ashamed. I am, Margaret said quietly. Then, after a pause, I didn't realize how much I'd let bitterness blind me. But no one answered her, and she finally turned and followed Delaney out the door. The silence that followed was heavy, but then Lily whispered, Are we really going to stay together? Rebecca knelt beside her. Yes, she said, voice steady with a promise that felt ironclad now. We're not going anywhere. The children erupted into soft hugs and quiet tears. Around them, the adults of Cedar Falls, once wary observers, now stood as something more, protectors, witnesses, and allies in a battle for belonging that had been hard won. Nathan placed a hand lightly on Rebecca's shoulder. You faced them all, and you didn't bend. They see it now. We all do. Rebecca looked around at the people gathered in Martha Wilson's parlor, at her siblings, safe and close, and at a town that had gone from suspicious to sheltering. For the first time since she had boarded that westbound train, she felt the unfamiliar certainty that they might just have a future here. What misunderstanding would that be, Margaret? Margaret's gaze flickered between Inspector Whitmore and the assembled community leaders, her confidence visibly wavering under their collective scrutiny. I may have been overly concerned about certain aspects of Mrs. Hayes' situation when I contacted the territorial office. Upon further reflection, I realize my concerns may have been premature. The admission hung in the air like confession at Sunday service, confirming what everyone had suspected about the source of the anonymous complaints. Inspector Whitmore's face flushed with obvious anger at being manipulated into pursuing an investigation based on personal grievances rather than legitimate welfare concerns. Mrs. Thornton, the inspector said with barely controlled fury, are you telling me that you filed false reports about child endangerment? Do you understand the seriousness of such actions? Margaret's companion stepped forward reluctantly, removing his hat in a gesture of nervous respect. Inspector, I'm Henry Campbell from the telegraph office. Mrs. Thornton asked me to send messages to the territorial office on her behalf, but she told me they were routine inquiries about educational standards. I had no idea she was making accusations against Mrs. Hayes. The revelation drew gasps from several people in the room, and Rebecca felt a surge of vindication mixed with residual anger at the malicious intent behind their ordeal. Margaret Thornton had deliberately tried to destroy their family out of personal resentment, using the territorial bureaucracy as a weapon against people who had done nothing but seek a better life. Sheriff Carter stepped forward, his expression grim with professional displeasure. Mrs. Thornton, filing false reports with territorial authorities is a serious offense. You've wasted government resources and caused unnecessary distress to this family based on what appears to be personal animosity. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as the weight of her actions became undeniable. I was trying to protect the community, she said desperately. Mrs. Hayes arrived with all those children and no husband, and Nathan was spending so much time helping her, and I thought, you thought you could drive away someone you saw as competition, Dr. Morgan interrupted coldly. You've put 7 innocent children at risk of separation from their guardian because you were jealous of attention Nathan Coleman chose to give elsewhere. The blunt assessment of Margaret's motivations seemed to deflate her remaining defenses. She sank into the nearest chair, her shoulders shaking with the release of emotions she had been suppressing throughout her campaign against Rebecca's family. Inspector Whitmore closed his portfolio with sharp efficiency, his anger at being deceived evident in every movement. Mrs. Thornton, you will be hearing from territorial authorities about the consequences of filing false reports. The penalties for such actions include substantial fines and potential criminal charges. He turned to face Rebecca with an expression that combined professional embarrassment with grudging respect. Mrs. Hayes, please accept my apologies for the distress this investigation has caused your family. Based on the evidence I've observed today, it's clear that your guardianship of these children is not only adequate but exemplary. Rebecca felt relief wash over her like cool water after fever, though the emotional exhaustion of the confrontation left her barely able to respond coherently. Thank you, Inspector. I hope this means our family can remain together without further interference. Your family will remain together, Inspector Whitmore confirmed firmly. Furthermore, I'll be filing a report recommending that the territorial government recognize your guardianship as a model of successful family preservation under difficult circumstances. Emma stepped forward with the dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the crisis. Inspector Whitmore, thank you for listening to us and for understanding that families can take different forms while still providing everything children need. The inspector's stern expression softened slightly as he addressed Emma directly. Young lady, your articulate defense of your family has been remarkable. You should be proud of your courage and your loyalty to those you love. As inspector, Whitmore gathered his materials and prepared to depart. Nathan moved closer to Rebecca, his presence solid and reassuring after the emotional turbulence of the afternoon. Are you all right? He asked quietly, his brown eyes searching her face for signs of lingering distress. I think so, Rebecca replied honestly, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftershocks of crisis averted. I keep expecting someone else to appear with new accusations or demands. No one else is going to threaten your family, Nathan said with quiet conviction. Not if I have anything to say about it. Are you and Mr. Coleman getting married? Emma asked, her voice a mix of curiosity, hope, and the unmistakable wisdom of a girl who had grown up too quickly but never lost her sense of wonder. Rebecca glanced at Nathan, who grinned, then looked back at Emma. There was no point in evading the truth, not with Emma, and certainly not with the rest of the children listening from the doorway, their eyes wide with anticipation. Not yet, Rebecca said, smiling through the tears still shimmering in her eyes. But we've decided that we'd very much like to build a life together, as a family, all of us. A small cheer erupted from the children, unrestrained and filled with unfiltered joy. Even the twins, who rarely grasped the full scope of adult conversations, sensed the importance of what had just happened and leapt into Nathan's arms without hesitation. He caught them easily, laughing as they clung to his neck and chattered with excitement. Emma nodded slowly, her expression serious but pleased. I think that's a good idea. He's already kind of like a papa, and he makes good pancakes. Lily chimed in, and he listens better than most grown-ups. Jacob gave a curt nod, and he fixed the fence without us even asking. Rebecca met Nathan's gaze, and for a long moment, words became unnecessary. This blend of affection, chaos, trust, and laughter was what they had both been searching for, even if they hadn't known it at the beginning. Martha Wilson re-entered the room, hands on her hips, surveying the scene with amused satisfaction. Well, I'll be, she said with a smile. Looks like Cedar Falls just got itself a new family, and the mining settlement a pair of partners with more heart and grit than half the territory. Pastor Miller chuckled. I suppose I'd best prepare a wedding sermon, just in case this turns into a summer of miracles. Rebecca laughed through her tears and nodded. One miracle at a time, Pastor, but yes, I think we're ready to begin. Outside, the sun rose higher over Cedar Falls, bathing the hills and rooftops in golden light. And in a small parlor, filled with the scent of coffee, cookies, and the warmth of community, the Hayes family's future, once fragile and uncertain, had begun to take root in the firm, fertile ground of home. Coleman planning something we should know about? Emma asked with the directness that characterized all her interactions with adult concerns. Rebecca and Nathan exchanged glances, both recognizing that any decisions about their future needed to include the children who would be affected by those choices. Mr. Coleman has asked me to marry him, Rebecca said simply. What do you think about that possibility? Emma's face brightened with the first unguarded smile Rebecca had seen from her in months. I think Mr. Coleman has been part of our family since the day we arrived in Cedar Falls, Emma said practically. Making it official would just catch the paperwork up with reality. Her response drew laughter from both adults and seemed to settle the question with characteristic Hayes family efficiency. Within minutes, the other children had been informed of the engagement, their responses ranging from Jacob's satisfied nod of approval to the twins' delighted clapping and Grace's immediate demand to know if she could be a flower girl at the wedding. The celebration continued as other community members arrived to check on the family's welfare after hearing rumors about the territorial investigation. Dr. Morgan proposed a toast to successful resistance against bureaucratic interference, while Pastor Miller offered to perform the wedding ceremony whenever the couple felt ready to proceed. As evening approached and the impromptu gathering began to wind down, Rebecca found herself standing on Martha Wilson's front porch with Nathan, watching the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their chosen home. The events of the day had transformed their relationship from friendship into partnership, their individual futures into shared destiny. When do you think we should have the ceremony? Nathan asked, his arm around Rebecca's shoulders providing warmth against the cooling air. Soon, Rebecca replied without hesitation. The children need stability, the mining families need our services, and I need to start believing that happiness is something we're allowed to keep rather than just borrow temporarily. Nathan's laughter rumbled through his chest in a sound that spoke of contentment and anticipation rather than mere amusement. Soon it is then. Pastor Miller can marry us next Sunday, and we can begin our new life at the mining settlement as husband and wife. The simplicity of the plan appealed to Rebecca after months of uncertainty and complex arrangements. A quiet wedding followed by immediate transition to their new home and work represented the kind of straightforward progress toward clearly defined goals that had been missing from their lives since leaving Boston. 1 month later, Rebecca Coleman stood in the doorway of the sturdy log cabin that served as both school and medical clinic for the Copper Creek mining settlement, watching her husband Nathan demonstrate proper horse care techniques to Jacob and Samuel while Emma conducted reading lessons for the younger children under the spreading pine tree that had become their outdoor classroom. The mining families had welcomed them with enthusiasm that bordered on relief, grateful for educational and medical services that had been desperately needed for years. The children had adapted to their mountain home with the resilience that had carried them through every previous transition, finding new friends among the miners' youngsters and new purposes in helping establish the settlement's first formal school. Rebecca's medical training had proven invaluable in treating everything from minor cuts and burns to a difficult childbirth that had tested every skill Dr. Morgan had taught her. The successful delivery of healthy twin boys to Mary and Jim Henderson had established her reputation throughout the mining community and brought a sense of professional accomplishment that exceeded anything she had experienced in her previous teaching career. The isolation that had worried territorial investigators had proven to be one of their greatest blessings. providing the space and peace necessary for 7 traumatized children to heal from loss and displacement, while building new identities as valued members of a close-knit community. The mining settlement felt more like home than anywhere they had lived since their parents' death, offering both security and purpose in measures Rebecca had never thought possible. As she watched Nathan swing 3-year-old Rose onto his shoulders, while Ruby demanded equal treatment, Rebecca marveled at the journey that had brought them from rejection and desperation to love and belonging. Thomas Hartwell's dismissal had seemed like catastrophe, but had actually been redirection toward the life they were meant to build together. The mountains that surrounded their valley caught the afternoon light like a benediction, and Rebecca Coleman smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had found her place in the world. They had traveled far from Boston's crowded streets and uncertain future, but they had arrived exactly where they belonged, together, useful and home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.